Hello, everybody, and welcome to the General Eclectic Podcast with Rod Dreer. I'm your host, Kale Zeldin, and we're excited to come back at you in our second season now, Rod. But we're always remote, I suppose, because I'm in Rhode Island and you're typically in Baton Rouge, but you're back in Hungary. And what's going on? How are things? And what is that? What are you get? Do you get all boozy on me? What is this?
I rented this apartment, and it's a really nice place. But the lady who lives here normally, she's a Hungarian American. Most of the time she lives in California, but she was apparently here last over Christmas. And oh man, this place is ready for parties. So come on over, Kale.
Yeah, I know. Well, I realize that my passport is out of date. Yeah, it's right here. But it is massively out of date here. And I looked on the website yesterday and I tried to make a phone call and all I could get on the other end was, it was weird. It was just sort of this cackling, this laughter.
That's cool.
They said, oh child.
Sweet summer child.
You're so cute, Kale. What are you thinking? Yeah. So anyway, it's like, they're saying something like 4 months.
Yeah. I've had, a lot of different friends learning that was going back to Hungary. I'm going to be here through the end of April. They're like, oh, I'd love to come see you, but my passport needs to be renewed. I'll get that done and come on over. I'm like, oh, no, you won't. No. I wish you could, but COVID has really done a number on the government when it comes to passports.
Yeah. Never the perhaps the model of efficiency really. It's what this is probably an old cranky talking point for guys like us, but it's when you start dealing with these sort of government bureaucracies, that's when any kind of thought that, oh, well, I'll just have the government run healthcare or the government run this or that. It's hard for me to take that too seriously, even though I'm sympathetic, because it's just so darn inefficient. It's just nothing gets done.
This is a point that it's worth mentioning for a second. Yeah. Last night here in Budapest, I was at a party and was talking to another American who's over here on a fellowship, an academic. He and his wife are there, and they were talking. They've been here for almost a year, and he said that what's really interesting is that in Hungary, the healthcare system is dirt cheap. Like you can, his wife had to have an MRI and it costs like $200, which is like 90% cheaper than in America. The problem is when you get really sick, you want to be back in America because this is the trade-off with socialized medicine. It's cheap, but the quality suffers because they can't do everything, right?
Yeah.
And, so this is, and this couple I was talking to, they're Catholics, and they have they believe that the system should work for everybody and all that. But it was just interesting to discuss the trade-offs there. And I mentioned that my son Matt last summer when we were both over here, we were in Bratislava in Slovakia next door, and he had a medical issue that he had to go to the hospital with and get like a boil lanced or something.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. And he said it was unbelievable to me. He just got there and it cost him $10 versus what it costs in America. But he said he had to wait in line in a room full of extremely sick people.
Yeah.
And he said they didn't use anesthesia.
Of course. Hey, so I gotta waste some good anesthesia on a lancing a boil. Come on, that's like you might as well go to the barber, right?
It was a school barber, but same thing.
Yeah.
But this friend of mine back in the U.S., a Czech emigre, said that when they were kids, I mean, he's about my age. He grown up in the 70s in communist Czechoslovakia. They had a dentistry without anesthesia.
My gosh, that is just no me gusta. I'm fine, thanks. I'll skip the dentist for 2 decades at that point. That's just
So don't come to Hungary if you're planning to get sick. And it's really weird to be over here right now, Kale. As you and I are talking, there's still a lot of chatter about Ukraine, Russia, Ukraine, and all that. As we're speaking, the Biden administration has told all Americans to get out of Ukraine. By the time this airs, an invasion could have happened. I hope not, But I tell you, it looks a lot different when you're living in a country as I am now that borders Ukraine.
Well, talk a little bit about that. I mean, I distinctly remember this, and I think we chatted about this, oh gosh, 20, 30 episodes ago. But, I just remember the first time being out of the country and seeing the country just from a different locale, a different sort of location on the globe. And it was just an interesting experience. And I was a young man then. But anyway, what are you seeing and sensing? I mean, what are you seeing?
It's really interesting to read the American media from Hungary and to see that the how do I put this? The push to war or to an American engagement, risking war with Russia, is so much greater on the other side of the ocean than it is here among the people who are going to have to live with it if it happens. I mean, I've been here now just over a week and had a conversation with a bunch of different Hungarians, and none of them want this war, and in part because if it happens, it's gonna cause a refugee crisis.
Of course,
it's gonna affect Hungary and other nations around it. Plus, these people know what it's like to be dominated by Russians, and they don't want to have the Russians on their border again. That said, I had one conversation with a pretty smart Hungarian who seemed to epitomize the conversations, a number of conversations I've had. He said, look, here's the deal. We Europeans, we know, and he's talking about not just the Hungarians, but the French, the Germans, et cetera. We know that we are too weak to defend ourselves. We also know that we can't count on the Americans. I mean, look at the last 20 years. And he said, we also know that most of us are totally dependent on Russian gas. That if we get on the wrong side of the Russians, our people are going to freeze in the winters. So these are just the strategic realities that
those are real things. And I think that, we are insulated. I'm here in the States, of course. I'm just completely insulated from any of that, of course.
Yeah. And so when I read Americans on my blog and in the media saying things like, well, we can't let Russia attack a sovereign state and all that. And I'm like, do you know what you're even talking about? Like, I don't want Russia to invade Ukraine, but you're living in this idealist fantasy world.
Well, okay, good. So you just sent me a link just before we got on. We're talking about critical military theory. It was a piece that the link is here below in the show notes. But I think it's probably, especially that first point, is probably an important one to bring up right now in terms of that kind of unreality of actual warfare versus this sort of mediated media warfare that we are accustomed to. Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was a piece that a friend of mine sent to me. It appears in Task and Purpose, which is a military journal. A retired Marine Corps Lieutenant General, Gregory Newbold, wrote a piece titled Critical Military Theory. And this is a cheeky slap at the wokeness taking over the military. And his basic point is this. He said, look, here's what an army is for. It's to win wars and to deter our enemies from attacking us, period, end of story. And you cannot have a military capable of doing that and also infuse it with all the values of the broader society. It just doesn't work. This is realism. And one of the points he makes in his piece, an excellent piece, is that we should only go to war when there are critical national security interests in play. He doesn't mention Ukraine here, but it's so clearly true about Ukraine. I don't want the Russians to invade Ukraine. I think it would be cruel and unjust. It would cause all these problems. But I swear, Kale, I cannot see where it is worth the United States getting into a shooting war with the Russians over Ukraine, which is right in its backyard. And some people say, well, Biden has not said that we're going to get into the war and all that. Do you know how easy it would be for this thing to go haywire? And
of course. I want to this, in other words, if a war goes haywire, in other words, if a war is a war, right? In war, chaotic things happen, actual people die. And I just want to read the opening paragraph of this piece because I think it really sets this up nicely. He says, many Americans, particularly our most senior politicians and military leaders, seem to have developed a form of dementia when it comes to warfare. The result is confusion or denial about the essential ingredients of a competent military force and the costs of major power conflict. The memory loss is largely irrespective of political bent because all too many are seduced by a Hollywood-infused sense of antiseptic warfare and push-button solutions, while forgotten are the 1 million casualties of the Battle of the Somme in World War I, or the almost 2 million in the Battle of Stalingrad in World War II. This warfare dementia is a dangerous and potentially catastrophic malady because the price for it could alter the success of the American experiment and most assuredly will be paid in blood.
Damn.
So you said that to me this morning. I'm like, whoa,
it's a truth bomb.
It's devastating. And then he goes on to sort of talk about, as you point, like, what is the military for? The military is for winning wars, period, full stop. And this kind of dementia, this warfare dementia that he mentions, is in part fueled by a kind of push button conception of what warfare is. And you see this in the movies all the time. And I remember seeing one movie, it might have been one of the Jack Ryan movies, the sort of Hunt for Red October versions. And there's this scene in it that, don't quote me on that, it might be a different movie, but there's a scene in which, there's this sort of diplomatic breakdown. And so the guy who's been trying to run the military, the diplomatic, to diffuse the situation, realizes he's lost and he goes back to Central Command and they go into the war room, right? And the war room, and it's like a series of screens, and it's like a video game, and you can see the people, mumbling into this and pressing these sort of buttons, and these things explode and blow up, and you're just like, oh my gosh, it actually is kind of like a video game, except it's not, right? It's a video game for those of us who sit on the comfortable sides of the monitors, on the comfortable sides of our laptops, on the comfortable sides of our globe. It's a whole other thing for those people who, are actually there on the ground, critical interest, and I think we think of geopolitics as a kind of semi-sophisticated game of Risk, the game we would play when we were kids.
Yeah, and the movie to watch about all this is is it The Fog of War? The Fog of War by Errol Morris, a great documentary filmmaker. He made this movie, came out, 15 years ago or so.
More, probably 20.
Yeah, 20, about Robert McNamara, the U.S. Defense Secretary, was the architect of the
it debuted at Sundance. I remember that. Yeah, I was actually there. Yeah, I was there, actually, oddly enough.
Well, a fantastic movie because what it is, it's about the difference between when you bring idealism and systematization, if that's a word I can use, to warfare. Because here was McNamara, one of the best and brightest, who
part of Camelot, right?
Defense Secretary who had previously been running Ford Motor Company. He comes to run the Pentagon and tries to apply management theory to the fighting of a war.
Right.
It's a fantastic movie because he came to regret this after late in life, he saw the folly of his ways, and he's a real tragic figure. But what's so great about the movie is that it shows that McNamara brought this technique and management technique to bombing people. And first of all, it didn't work, and it caused so much destruction. And the movie is a testimony to hubris and testament to the hubris of idealism.
And I ultimately think it's the hubris of modernism, and maybe we can get into that later on with a different episode. But it really is this idea that we are masters and controllers of nature. And this is Descartes, right? I mean, I know that I'm the academic nerd here, but it really is that myth in the sense of how we understand the world, that we can actually control things, that the world is essentially a spreadsheet with data, with zeros and ones offs and ons, and what you see in that McNamara piece, or implied in that piece for sure, is that notion, is the hubris of it all. That's exactly right, Rod.
Well, and you go back to General Newbold's piece that we were talking about
Yep.
critical military theory, and he has a point in there about the folly of trying to remake society, because that's not what military is for, and we can't do that.
Okay. Why? Okay. I have a question for you, as a fellow, watcher of history, a reader of history, engager in history. Why do we think we can do that? Like, what historically led us to think that we could just remake a society using the military? I mean, is it the Marshall Plan?
Yeah, Japan and Germany.
Yeah. Okay.
But that worked in part because those two countries, Japan and Germany, were sophisticated enough to where they could, the ideas of liberal democracy could take there. I mean, it's a complicated story, but I think that we are in some ways prisoners of World War II thinking.
Amen. Yeah. Look, we alluded to this last week, Rod. I mean, we this World War, this sort of the PTSD, the unacknowledged PTSD of what we won and lost through World War II seems to continue to dominate the way that we see the world.
Totally. And not just in terms of we can't remake the world, but the idea that America, as long as we can apply massive force to any situation, we can shape the world according to our own sense of reality. And there's that quote you might remember from early in the Iraq War, an unnamed White House official, Bush White House official, I think it was Karl Rove, it's recognized as Karl Rove, was criticizing the media for their criticism of the way they handled the Iraq War. He said that we create our own reality. Now, that is not the most
perfect. Perfect, right? Yeah, it's hubris.
Well, and I remember back then that as we were marching up to the Iraq War, there was this constant rhetoric in the society that if you didn't support the war, then you were indifferent to the cruelty of Saddam Hussein, that you were indifferent to what allowing him to stay in power would mean. We had the constant talk about being prisoner of World War II. We had the constant reference to Neville Chamberlain in Munich and all that. And it led us into a total debacle. And you see it happening again here. I don't think that Russia should invade Ukraine, but you know what? This Ukraine has been part of the greater Russia for centuries. It's right there on the border. The Russians care infinitely more about the nation of Ukraine than Americans do because it's right there. And I've noticed that, talking about the idealist, I've gotten into this argument on my blog with some people. They're like, we can't allow one nation to invade another sovereign nation. And I say, but Russia has a legitimate interest in keeping Ukraine out of NATO. I mean, it just does. And they say, but we can't have a world order where a nation gets to tell another one that what it can and can't do militarily. Like, can you imagine, Kale, somebody walking into the Oval Office when President Kennedy was managing the Cuban Missile Crisis and saying, hold on, Mr. President, Cuba is a sovereign nation. It has the right to allow the Soviets to put missiles there. That person would have been kicked out and should have been kicked out. This is realism. But
I like that's a great example. I think the Cuban Missile Crisis is operative. It's interesting. This is a very early 60s dominated episode here. We're talking about McNamara, we're talking about Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and interestingly, of course, the great optimism of the Kennedy era. What is it? The New Frontier and all of that. And we still are drunk on that, high on our own supply about that stuff. Is it the sort of the scene? Is it the great boomer promise, do you think?
I don't know, man. Perhaps. I hate to blame them for everything.
But no, I don't mean that. I don't mean it. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying though that I think that it's the disconnect. It's not just the boomers. I mean, to the whole the piece that you've put up there by General Newbold has made me think beyond the military. Like what to what extent are our ideals getting in the way of allowing basic functions of society to happen, to things to fulfill their telos?
Yes.
Newbold is talking about the telos of the military and how you
Hmm.
can't have a military that quote unquote looks like society and let it do its job.
And
You know,
just, and again, what is its job? What is the
to
military's job, Ron?
to win
Win
wars and to
wars.
deter enemies from attacking us.
Right.
Period. End of
Right.
story. Not to be a social experiment. But
Right.
that's what General Thoroughly postmodern Milley is engaged in, right? And our civilian leaders and making the military woke. But let's go beyond that.
Yeah. Yeah.
What you're a teacher in a school.
Mm-hmm.
What is the telos of a school, and how does do the current liberal or progressive ideals get in the way of that?
Sure, sure. Well, that's a great question, and I think this is in fact, I think that it is the question for schools right now. But I get your point. This is sort of a meta point about teleology, and right now, if you look at the currents of the educational establishment, it is all going in one direction. It is all going in the direction of a kind of hyper progressive woke DEI standpoint, diversity, equity, inclusion. And this is both in private schools and in public schools. And they would say that the point of education, the telos of education, is to disrupt and to dismantle. Now, I'm talking about the people who run things.
Yeah.
Sort of the theoretical engines in the educational, the places, the credentialing agencies, both from a standpoint of schools of education, but also places like the NAIS and the teachers unions, the National Association of Independent Schools, and so much of this is about this alleged disrupting and dismantling. Now, I can get into the weeds with this quite a bit, but I think most of our listeners, my guess, would say something to the effect of, if I asked them, well, what is a school for? Many of our listeners would probably say, well, I would like for my child to learn how to read. I would like for my child to learn how to figure. I would like for my child to learn how to think. I would like for my child to be competent in writing. The sort of those basic sort of competencies. Yeah. Now, I would add on to that I think the telos of education is ultimately cultural transmission. But I would certainly be in the radical minority in terms of that. Sure. Most people would say that the point of education is to educate, to create "quote unquote" critical thinkers. And in the nomenclatura of the DEI folks, becoming a critical thinker means you become imbued with the virtues of critical race theory, which is to see power and see race and to see all of those things that we've talked about before. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you would have a certain kind of transactional opinion about what education is for. And a lot of wealthy parents are ultimately concerned about class anxiety. In other words, the purpose of an education is instrumental in terms of placing their children in the corridors of power and influence, right? The path to Goldman Sachs, so to speak, right? Now, I would disagree with the DEI folks on the left, and I would disagree with the instrumentalist folks on the other side. It's not really conservative or right wing, but the instrumentalists, the utilitarians, and say, actually, what school is about is ultimately cultural transmission. And that's what I think the fight really is about, cultural transmission.
Well, you're saying that brings to mind an ad I saw this week for Nike, total woke capitalist firm. The ad features a young Black woman, looks like a college student, talking about how there she is sitting in class and having to read about all these dead white men, European men.
Like that. No, I have not. But that happens anywhere. That's such a joke.
Yeah.
Such a joke.
She goes, and in fact, she says, I want to pay attention to dynasties I can look up to. And then she goes on to talk about the U.S. women's national basketball team. She goes, there are people who look like me, people of color. they are lesbian. They on and on and on. She says, and they're greater than Alexander the Great. And I'm watching this, and it's like some right-wing parody of
Right.
but
That's right. That's right.
but,
In
but
my
here's
worst.
what's yeah, but here's what's so interesting about it.
Mhm,
According to the point that you were just making about cultural
mhm,
transmission,
mhm.
this ad, which is funded by one of the richest corporations on earth, says that education is about not about achievement, not about learning history. In fact, education is about affirming the individual in
Sure.
his or her sense of identity. And it's really an amazing thing. I'm sure that Nike, they saw this, and they know what they're after. They're trying
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
exploit it, but it is truly a sign of decadence because
What do you
you
mean
know
by that?
what I mean by that is, if you talk about how education is about cultural transmission, transmitting the values we have, the idea that to teach about the Greeks and the Romans, for example, because that's where
Mhm.
the ad starts out making fun of that, or rejecting that,
Amazing.
that,
Amazing.
that's only about telling white people that you're good. I mean, as if the Greeks and the Romans were white, according to our
Right. Right.
understanding
Right.
of.
Right.
I
Right.
mean, it's just a totally corrupt ideology. And the idea that the right thing to do instead is to focus on the US women's basketball team because they win games and they're black and lesbian, or many of them are lesbian.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's, but I would not want my kids to go to a school where they were taught um, that we should pay attention to a football team. It's more important than the Greeks and the Romans because a football team, they're from the South. They look like you, and
Yeah.
just
Right.
crap like that. But look, this way of education, this way of seeing our what it means to be an educated person. Ooh, what
Sorry.
was that?
My computer keeps freaking out. So they reset my computer here at the office, and now I've got I used to have all my notifications turned off because I hate them and they're evil. But now they're turned back on and it won't shut up. So anyway,
Right.
go ahead.
Anyway, it's decadent because it prevents the school or education from fulfilling its telos. Now we can, all education is not the same. The kind of education that you get if you go to a trade school, you need to know how to run the machines or how to fix things. It's
Right.
different from a liberal arts education. I get that, but the idea that the point of being an educated person is to learn how to affirm your own feelings. I mean, it's
Mhm.
just nuts. And
Well, all right, well, here, it's okay. So let me jump in here. Are feelings and a sense of identity enough upon which you can build a society? I
no,
think that's right, right. That's really what it comes down to. Like, upon what can you build a society? And what are the limits of stretching that, right?
all right,
Um,
here's a great example this week,
okay,
and I
okay,
was hoping we could talk about this.
yeah.
You've seen on my blog the whole thing about Sam Brinton.
Oh yeah,
He
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's
Yes,
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Sam Brinton is an LGBT activist, non-binary, but I'm not going to use his they them pronouns. I'm going to call him him. He weirdly enough got
You
a
you awful person.
I know, I'm a
You. I
hater. I'm
know.
a
I
hater.
know. Just.
He got a degree in nuclear engineering from MIT, a really smart guy, but he
Yeah.
became known for his activism with the Trevor Project, which is an NGO, I guess you would call it, that's devoted to ending what do you call it? Conversion
Conversion
therapy.
therapy. You're right. His story is that he was raised a Southern Baptist and allegedly underwent some kind of, I don't know, conversion therapy of
Very
some sort.
cruel yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and I've
There are
seen
questions.
that.
There are questions about that story, but I don't want to get
Yeah,
into the weeds
questions
of it
about
too
the
much.
story, but you can
Right, right.
tell if you go
You
back
get
and
the
watch.
yeah.
Yeah, if you go back and watch his public testimonies,
Mhm.
I mean, it hits a sweet spot. It's too good to check, because here he is, this tender young man who was
Mhm.
brutalized by these fundagelical
Right,
Baptists, and now
right.
he's there to fight to make sure it doesn't happen again. Well, look, I think most of us would object to conversion therapy, or at least that kind of conversion
Really,
therapy, no problem. But what
right.
he's done is he's used this platform to advocate for the total normalization of sexual diversity, such that today he presents himself. He wears dresses and high heels sometimes. And he's a sadomasochist, an open sadomasochist. I put on my blog an account of him going to the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute a few years ago and giving a demonstration about sadomasochism. And he even practiced on the kids there, and they thought it was wonderful. Well, this guy has been hired at the Department of Energy as some sort of nuclear expert. And I mean, people on the right are going nuts about this, but they're saying, and I said that this is an example of the Biden administration's lunacy, celebrate diversity, lunacy. This guy is a menace, is a freak. And
but for them, it's a win-win, right? I mean, you've got a guy who, at least on paper, sounds to me like a competent scientist of some sort, in the field of his expertise. But you get the sort of the intersectional victory by having this non-binary BDSM enthusiast / advocate. I mean, this is perfect for them. I mean, this is absolutely perfect.
Oh, sure. And I put on the blog this thing. He was in a story a few years ago talking about how he was a master who led around his quote unquote pup. There is a kinky community of gay men, some of whom want to behave like dogs. They wear collars, they get fake tails and shove them up their butts,
and like masks, like leather masks that look like pot dogs or cartoon dogs.
I mean, it is the sickest stuff he talks about in this article, and he's proud of it, right?
Yeah.
Sam Brinton is a master of a pup, and he talks about how when he and his pup are engaged in sexual intercourse, the pup doesn't necessarily want to come out of puppiness. I mean, it's a
character.
It's pseudo bestiality, right? I mean, and somebody like Sam Brinton ought to be ashamed of himself and ought to be seen as a moral defective and a mental health case. But that's not our society. Instead, he's valorized, and the people who would see this guy coming and say, "Wait a minute, stay away from me, pal. I don't want your insanity near me." Those are the people who are damned in this order, the social order that we live in now. The reason I bring him up, Kale, is what happens to a society that valorizes freaks like that? And I mean, it's not just that he's gay. I mean, heterosexuals do the same thing. There's this guy.
No, it's the valorization of kink as a valuable aspect and even a building block of a culture. I mean, that's what this is being passed off as. Like, this is a good thing. This is not like, oh, to each his own. We all have our freak or whatever it is. This is, no, it's quite the contrary. No, okay. So I wanted to ask you this. Like, this is I tweeted this to you, I texted you the other day. Like, it's a perfect Rorschach test for the fragility or the anti-fragility of a society and a culture. And what I mean by that is that, there is this tendency, and I must admit that it is, a pull in me too, as someone who is formed in, the American experiment here, is look, what Sam rocks on his free time is Sam's business. This should have nothing to do with his competency with his energy role. So why is that insufficient? Why is that? What's wrong with me for not being able to sort of offer that as a sort of a full-throated, get back into your hole, Rod Dreher, get back into your cave, Rod Dreher.
Well, for one thing, on his website, Sam Brinton talks about his activism and how he talked about going to the White House and wearing high heels in the White House because he wants his presentation to spark conversations. In other words, he's getting in the face of normies and daring them to say something.
What if they say something?
Well, I guess he would jump all over them. But so can you imagine this guy? This is how he rolls, and he thinks this is great. He's bringing his whole self to work. He's challenging prejudices and all that. Can you imagine what it's like to work with him at the Department of Energy, to be in his area, either work for him or with him? This guy is going to be provocative intentionally. He's not going to be about learning how to work as part of a team. He's going to be about intimidating people into affirming him.
Right. And to be clear, like, if I'm working next to a Sam, I'm not worried that I'm going to somehow get like knocked over the head and wind up in somebody's sex dungeon. I'm worried that no, but seriously, I'm worried that anything that I say, I'm talking and focused on energy policy and international relations and nuclear energy, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm worried that anything that I say or eyebrow that I raise, is going to be weaponized against me.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so it's a Trojan horse of sorts for something that has nothing to do with energy policy or expertise.
Right. I remember back in 1993, I was a young journalist in Washington, and I went down to the mall to cover the big Million Man March for LGBT equality. They had like 800,000 to 1 million people there. And this is where the whole modern gay rights movement, as we know it, the post-Stonewall movement, got going. Yeah. And I was down there covering it.
Do you remember the month by any chance?
April.
Okay. April. Yep. All right. I have a story for you on this one too. So
it was
keep going.
April 25th, 1993.
Yep. Right. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I was down there in the mall covering it, and there were a lot of like normie bourgeois gays and lesbians there, the kind of people that I knew, and I thought that this would be who it was. But Kale, there were so many people like Sam Brinton, elderly leather men being dragged along by their masters through with chains connected to rings and their pierced nipples. I mean, just weird crap. There was this one group called the Radical Fairies, and their kink was to dress up like elves and sprites and things like that. I was
totally normal. Totally normal.
I was standing right next to this guy, and you're going to think I'm making it up, but believe me, I wasn't. This young man who was covered in leaves, he was wearing some sort of dress of leaves, and he had coming out of his backside a branch that had somehow been inserted in his backside and strapped to himself, and it was spread out like a peacock feather, but dragging the ground like it was a train of Princess Diana's wedding dress, right? And there were so many people like that. I thought, oh my God, wait till the normies in America see what has happened here. Well, guess what? There was no coverage of that. All the coverage just showed the normie bourgeois gays and lesbians who were there. And but that wasn't it at all. As I recall, I've never been able to find this online, but as I recall, Andrew Sullivan, who was at the New Republic that time, wrote something about how the media distorted this. And Andrew Sullivan, of course, is a leading gay rights activist. But he pointed out that, and I think he was criticizing the media for not showing the full diversity of the LGBT community. He pointed out that the media was managing this narrative, not to scare the normies away from supporting gay rights. Well, this is how we get to Sam Brinton, to the normalization of Sam Brinton. It was there from the very beginning, because if your only standard for judgment is self-expression, people should be able to express themselves. And if you put no barrier to this, to how far this sexual kink can go, you get Sam Brinton being not only an employee openly like this as an employee of the Department of Energy, you get him valorized as a hero for being precisely the freak that he is.
So, my brother, who's been on this podcast, Mark, was at the time in Washington, D.C. during that exact same time, Rod. And he was a young staffer I think on the House side at that point. And I was in Rome during college. I spent a semester in Rome. And on my way back home from Rome, I stopped and visited with my brother. This was in May. And so when I get there, Mark and I, whatever, we were hanging out, and, we went out and, we had no money. Both of us were like, this is like one of those things where you're counting quarters to buy a 6-pack of beer, that kind of thing. And, he was a young staffer, maybe even an intern, but anyway, you get the idea. Anyway, we got to talk, and he's like, Kale, you wouldn't believe what I saw a month ago. And he's talking about the exact same thing. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And he started laying it. He said, Kale, you wouldn't believe it. I'm like, all right, come on, Mark, because, at that time, I was early 90s. I was basically libertarian, probably with certain conservative leanings. I'm a young guy. Like, what do I, it was always like, look, you do you. I mean, that was sort of, that's what I had kind of downloaded from the culture is like, look, tomato, gay, fine, like, fine. What does that have to do with me? All that sort of stuff. And Mark was like, yeah, I was exactly like that, Kale. until I saw this stuff. He said, Kale, you wouldn't believe it. And look, neither of us were like naive little like hicks from, from the farm. I mean, we read all the same stuff, watched all the same movies, and he just could not believe it. And then, that really marked him. Sorry, that really, changed. That, I think that was the first time where he was able to convey to me that the narrative was being curated. I think at that point I sort of believed that, look, if shit happened, we'd hear about it. I really did think that. I really, really did think that. And I'll tell you, Rod, that has stayed with me. I think that's, if that's not the moment, it's certainly a crucial moment in terms of me seeing things, that what we're seeing is not the whole story. Now, I know that might sound a little bit pat coming from me and you, but Rod, we've just lived through 2.5 years of people having total trust in the narrative as if it's just, we're seeing the full picture. And so much so, that, we were talking, anyway, I don't want to get into the Canadian thing just yet, but I want to continue with the Sam Brinton business, that, why should we care about it, right? I mean, I think that's something that is important for us to sort of wrestle over. Why is it somehow insufficient to say, if these stories are true, it doesn't matter?
Because of the next generation. I mean, it seems to me, let me take the view from 50,000 feet.
Yeah, right. And I think that's exactly
it seems to me that the primary purpose of any society, not just our society, but any society, is to produce the next generation. I mean, this is a Darwinian point. If you can't produce the next generation, then you have failed.
I would argue that it's a Genesis point, but go ahead.
Oh, yeah, well, that too. But I mean, I'm just saying, you don't even have to be religious. Produce the next generation. Are we doing that? Look at what's happening right now around us. And we are seeing the young generation, they're not reproducing, they're confused. Some of them are going deep into this insane rabbit hole of, am I a man? Am I a woman? Am I this? What am I? Am I a furry? And all that. And there are no guardrails anymore. We have created a society that is incapable of doing what all societies must do. And it's not just about LGBT, gender theory and all that. It's about pornography too. And I think that there has to be a deep connection between the disorder of someone like Sam Brinton and the ubiquity of porn and ease of access of hardcore pornography. Because what happens is, all of us human beings, we are made up of all kinds of disordered passions. There's good and there's bad in every human heart. But we've created a society that takes our basest passions, our passions for our sexual desire, and valorizes it and says the weirder, the better. Celebrate diversity. No, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, so this really brings up something that I'm wanting to talk about. And I was watching maybe a Jonathan Peugeot video about a month ago, and he was talking about liturgies and this sort of thing. And he was making the point that our liturgies form us. Okay. And what he means, liturgy is sort of like the work of the people, but those things that we do in kind of liturgical fashion, they form us. And liturgies are sort of almost kind of like personal adopted algorithms of self.
That's good.
Yeah, really good, right? And he makes this point, or maybe I'm extrapolating from his layup. Anyway, you get the idea. He makes the point that we even sin liturgically, right? And I was like, that really struck me. So he said that even the way in which we deviate from the norms of our ideals are done in such a way that are liturgical. Like we enter into it, we do this and we do this and this in this sort of sequence, in this order, and there's a time and all of that sort of thing. And that blew me away when he started talking about that even our sins have patterns, right? And by sins, of course, we mean missing the mark, right? We mean, the not living up to what we believe is good. But can anti-liturgies, right? And what is more liturgical, right, than BDSM? Right? What is more liturgical than the sort of education into BDSM that we see in those Sam Brinton videos, right? There's a process. There are words, there are holy words. I mean, I know this gets a little bit weird, and I'm sorry
but it's true. But you're right. You're right. It's important,
right? And the point, of course, of the liturgy is to form us. Now, you and I come from deeply liturgical traditions, right? Me as a Roman Catholic, you as a member of the Orthodox Church, like, both of us are, we care about liturgy, and I must say, I'm jealous of your liturgy in many ways. But anyway, the point of liturgy, and the point of, like, for instance, of a rosary or prayer beads or any of these sorts of things, is that the activity itself, you're taking the impulse, and the activity forms who we are as people, right? So and so then the question is, are your liturgies forming you to perversion, or are your liturgies forming you to perfection?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And you can,
hugely important, right? Hugely important.
And it only works. Let me just say that implies an idea of what is the good, what is the capital G good.
Absolutely. And telos, right? What are we for?
Right. What are we for? And the Augustinian point here is that we are what we love. What you desire is what you will ultimately become. And the Sam Brinton story, and I mean, he's just an example. He's maybe a condensed symbol.
That's how I'm using him. As a condensed symbol, right?
It trains us. A culture that valorizes somebody that has done that with themselves and preaches those values is a culture that wants to form people into that model. Or at least make that as a possible goal for its young people, and it also trains them to go with their disordered desires, with the desire that twists sexuality into something that's all about power. I think that it's not a radical thing to say that almost all of us have at some point deep down these impulses. Like, I don't want to be a pup or anything like that, but all of us are sinners. All of us have these disordered desires. The point of a healthy society, the point of a religion, the point of a moral code, of a culture is to draw us out of that disorder, out of cruelty, out of destruction, and order us to reality, order us to the good. Now, what's happening in America now is we have these people who are completely against what, moral traditionalists, conservatives, Christians, Jews, Muslims, and all that. What we consider to be the good, they consider to be the bad. But what they're doing is they are using the language of liberalism, of tolerance, and all of that to work this cultural and liturgical revolution.
And this is where the thin gruel of something like consent, I think, exposes itself as just insufficient to the job. We can't have a culture that's based on Kennedy-esque self-definition, from the I always forget the line from the Supreme Court decision, the mystery of being, or
the sweet mystery of life is Scalia.
Right. So, this is something that I tell my students all the time, and it's a quote, and I'm going to read from you. I think it's appropriate. In the modern era, we have inverted the role of culture. Instead of teaching us what we must deprive ourselves of to be civilized, we have a society that tells us we find meaning and purpose in releasing ourselves from the old prohibitions. That's something you said about a decade ago on your blog, and I stole it. Yeah, you said this.
I was thinking that sounds like Philip Reef. That's pretty good.
It probably is. It probably is you riffing on Reef. Right? Maybe that should have been the blog. We're riffing on Reef. And then you go on, you finish up by saying, to be modern is to believe in one's individual desires as the locus of authority and self-definition. And there's nothing more acidic and corrosive to a culture than to assert that the locus of authority and self-definition is in individual desire. And if a liturgy is designed in such a way that creates that, you're on the clock. The thing's dying. The thing's dead.
Well, how many of us normal people can look at somebody like Sam Brinton and say, yeah, we would like that for our child. We want our child to be. I don't think anybody can.
No, of course not. Of course not. And that's always the lie of it, right? It's like, it's fine for like that weirdo Sam, like he's great. We love Sam, but not my kid. Or even worse, you get to, well, my kid's special. You look at the, the moms of the trans rights, as you've written about before. It's like this weird, I don't know, vicarious living through or something. I don't know.
And they're having, and I'm hearing about that. I have friends who are dealing with trans, friends of theirs who are parents of kids who say they're trans. And it is brutal the way these trans parents, so to speak, that's a weird phrase, the way they treat their friends, right? Such that they're demanding that as a condition of continuing the friendship, that their friends must affirm their trans kids.
Right.
And because I think this is all part of parents having to suppress the sense that things are wrong here. Things are deeply wrong, but I have to get everybody to pretend that things are okay so I can feel okay about it. And and I want to bring this up to maybe this can conclude the discussion on this point, because it's dark. They're talking about the whole consent thing. There's a case came out a couple of years ago, and actually in 2018 in San Francisco, about this man named Dylan Hafertapen. Dylan Hafertapen was what Sam Brinton is, the master of a pup kennel or whatever. And these are all gay men involved in kink and all that. And he was, he treated them like slaves, and they wanted to be treated like slaves. I mean, this was all consenting, right? Well, his name became public after the death of one of his so-called pups, an Australian man named Jack Chapman, who was 28. Chapman became, joined this sex cult of Dylan Hafertapen, and they were all the members. I think there were like 8 guys in there. They became very, very buff, started taking steroids and all that. Well, and I beg the pardon of listeners for telling you what happened, but it's important. This guy, Jack Chapman, this young Australian guy, died because he allegedly was ordered by his slave master, the pup master, to inject his scrotum with silicone to make his testicles the size of a basketball.
Oh my God.
He did this, and the silicone got into his bloodstream, hit his lungs, and he died. Now, Jack Chapman's mother back in Australia grieving her son, but she blamed Dylan Hafertapen for this. I don't know how this thing was ultimately resolved legally. It may not have been resolved. I don't know. The point is simply
probably settled out of court.
But Jack Chapman did this willingly. He consented to this. Hafertapen didn't force him to do any of this. I mean, in the sense of holding a gun to his head. I mean, it was part of a kinky master-slave relationship in which Jack Chapman handed his free will over to his quote-unquote master, who used that relationship to compel him to do things that destroyed his free will, his capacity for freedom, and destroy his body and ultimately his life. Now, I bring that up because this is the ultimate end of the Sam Brintons of the world. There can be no parent, no good, decent parent in this world who wants for their child what happened to Jack Chapman. But that is what the valorization of people like Sam Brinton and heterosexuals who are engaged in this too. This is what's happening. And I bring this back to Hungary, Kale. Last night I was at a party and here in Budapest, and I found myself talking with some people there, including the Hungary's justice minister, who is this woman, Judith Varga. She's just blessedly normal. And I was standing there with an American academic and his wife, and we were all trying to explain to Judith Varga and the other Hungarians around how incredibly insane American life is. And you can tell even that these are people who didn't fall off the turnip truck. These are very cosmopolitan international people. And yet, God bless them, they still look at us like, you're having me on, aren't you? You can't be serious. And we're like, oh, no, this is true.
As you're laying out this story, this sad story of the Australian in San Francisco, I wonder how much our laptop class is serious about stories like this. like how weird and strange and bad it can really get. It's not normal. And I know people hate using the word normal, right? Because, oh, who's to say who's normal? That kind of crap, the kind of thing you did when you were, an undergrad and smoking pot or something. It's just like so dumb. It's like, really normal? We're going to argue about basic norms. And yet here we are. You hear that story and, you wonder, do you have a moment of self-recognition like, yeah, so, this is my life. I dress up. My liturgy is that I dress up in leather and I pretend to be a dog. And I let another person dressed up in leather order me around and do strange things. And you sort of think to yourself, yeah, this is what I've been put on earth for. This is it. This is me. This is my meaning and purpose in life. I can't accept that. I just don't accept that. That's not what we're for. And for people, for privileged people to sort of stand back and say, well, like what a person does in his sex dungeon is his business. I'm like, no, it actually has an effect. Like I'm having a hard time sort of articulating exactly how I ground that, but it actually matters. And no amount of you shaming me into being judgmental or, all this, none of that's going to work because I know it's garbage. Yep. I know it's garbage. I know it's hell, actually.
But there are a lot of people out there, Kale, who know this, but they're afraid to assert it because they're afraid of being judged harshly by their friends, by their people in their professional lives. So they conform.
Right.
So they're willing to sacrifice their own children for the sake of conforming. And it's hell. And I said on my pod this week, and I'd love to know what you think about this.
Mm-hmm.
The situation is starting to remind me of what happened to the poet W.H. Auden in Manhattan in 1939. He was an Englishman who was living in Manhattan when the Germans invaded Poland and started World War II. He went up to see a movie in a German neighborhood in Upper East Side. And the German newsreel was showing the Nazi soldiers attacking the Poles, and all these German immigrants started standing up screaming, kill them, kill them, kill them.
Right.
And Auden got the hell out of there. And he said that he had to think about what force is there in the world strong enough to stand up against that kind of evil. And this
There's only one.
Auden caused him to turn and go back to the church.
Yeah.
Now,
well, yeah, and as our friend Paul Vanderklay, would say, these spirits, you think about these German immigrants in an Upper East Side German neighborhood, when such things existed,
it's a working class neighborhood.
In Manhattan, back in the day. Now it's all, of course, not. But anyway, those spirits, like, look, fine. This collection of German immigrants came over and they're living in the United States of America, living in Manhattan and doing their thing. It's like they're still German. Right. And so those spirits, and again, I'm not making this a specific argument about Germans per se. I'm really not playing that game. I'm saying that all of us are the products of spirits that are living and working through us. And these spirits are long. Right. I mean, like, think about, you, Rod, this young boy from Star Hill, Louisiana, doing your thing there in Hungary, Budapest. But those spirits that you downloaded or were created in are still coursing through you right now, even though you're living this sort of strange, semi-bohemian intellectual life in Budapest, Hungary right now. Right. And so much of those tensions that you have felt as a man are those tensions of those competing spirits for who and what you are. And again, there's not necessarily a moral valence to that in your example, but, just like me, like, I'm comprised of all of, like, my ancestors, and we don't talk about that, even though we talk about that in the Old Testament all the time, the faith of our fathers, right? I mean, even that kind of idea is like, oh, we don't talk about that. I am who I am. I am my own buffered individual self. But what Auden sees in that moment is that those spirits are there, whether we want to pretend they are there or not, right? Sort of that myth of the buffered self versus the porous self. And the only way to combat those bad spirits that course through us is to adopt a spirit that is ultimately more powerful than those darker, visceral, chthonic, fury-ridden spirits that we all have in us. Only the Holy Spirit. Only the Holy Spirit. I think that's what Auden would say, is that only the Holy Spirit can ultimately manage and channel those lower spirits.
Well, yeah, because I guarantee you that none of the people, those German immigrants in that
neighborhood, theater,
they none of them were tempted by the evil spirits that have taken over Sam Brinton and people like him.
Right.
They were tempted. They had their own dark spirits, as each one of us does.
Right. And so,
yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, and we have to anchor ourselves in something outside of ourselves in order to keep from being washed away by the flood of our disordered passions. And this, I mean, to sort of sum up politically, this is why I'm beginning to really, I've tried so hard to hold on to classical liberalism because, I don't want to I want to live in a society where we can be reasonably tolerant, with all blah, blah, blah. But
throat clearing. But good enough. Go ahead.
Yeah. No. But I'm just seeing that what it means to be a classical liberal now, divorced from any, if classical liberalism is not anchored in something outside of itself, something that sets the boundaries and sets the basis of it, which, for us in the West has been the Christian religion.
Of course.
Then you end up with Sam Brinton. I don't see it any way outside of it. And I don't know what this means for us.
Well, and remember, it's a devouring ideology. If you look at it's a master-slave dialectic, for God's sakes. I mean, if you look at this kennel kink, right, the whole point is that it's illiberal. Ironically enough, the whole point is that it reestablishes and reinscribes, to use the lingo of the critical theorists, it reinscribes the master-slave dialectic. That's what the vision is. And for us to sort of pretend like that's perfectly compatible. That liturgy doesn't change him at all. He can do all that, and it's going to have no bearing on his ability to do the job. I call foul. I don't believe it. I don't buy it. I think it forms us. So the question is, to me, when we think about this in sort of a liturgical sense, what liturgies are you going to adopt consciously to fight off the unconscious algorithms, spirits, liturgies? What are our default liturgies, and are they good or bad? You need to make sure because our liturgies form us.
Yeah. Well, it's what's the line from the Old Testament about, I set before you life and death, choose life. This is God. Right. And this is becoming very, very stark now.
Yeah.
And somebody like Sam Brinton, he represents death, the death of the soul, the death of moral order, the death of humanity.
It's a death work in the Reithian sense, right? I mean, it is turning the sex act, which is meant to be both unitive and procreative, right? That is it's a divine gift. We know that, but it's a death work. You're turning it into kink, which is death.
And look at what, we need to let this go. But let me just say, look at what the quote that's on my blog, that the pup who was enslaved to Sam Brinton back a few years ago, what he said when they were having sexual congress, he didn't want to get out of the pup headspace because somehow he found it easier to focus on the pleasure around him. I'm like, when I'm talking about the death of the human being, that's it.
That's right.
He has reduced himself to a simulacrum of animality. Yeah. And it's a very, very short step between that and actual bestiality.
That's right.
And this is going on everywhere in our society now. This is happening so fast. And when talking to these Hungarians about it last night, I was reminded of how the lie that our media, which the media all loves this Sam Brinton stuff, the lie that they
because it gets guys like you and me, right? It gets us upset, right? That's the whole stick it to the stuffies,
The lie that they tell about Hungary, I found out, some friend of mine here sent me some leaked recordings of people who were involved with George Soros and the Open Society Foundation. He's the big enemy of Viktor
Yeah, yeah.
Orban and all that. These people were recorded saying that the Soros people and their allies distort and lie about what Hungary is about to try to, blacken the reputation of this country and the Orban government. And I don't want to go down that hole. It'll quickly bore our listeners, but I just want to say that this all goes back into cultivating the liturgy that proper liberals want us and progressives want us to live by, is that the Hungarians and their government, they're fascist, and they're against, they hate LGBTs and all that. Well, guess what? You are being played, American people. You're being played about this country. You're being played about what is good and what is evil. And I've exhausted myself.
Yeah, no. We'll just end it on this. I mean, I think that, look, everybody has liturgy. Choose wisely.
Choose wisely. And
right.
well, I'm sorry you're not going to be able to come over here, my friend.
I know, I'm bummed.
Because
bummed.
Yeah, it's a really interesting place. Not paradise. There is no paradise. But as far as I know, they have anesthesia on dentistry, and and it is so unbelievably normal here.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that I was thinking this last night on the way home from the party, that the way things are here, it feels like it was back in the 90s in America, when there was a lot of diversity. There really is here, and there's no suppression of speech, whatever you've read in the press. But things seem solid, and the people here who are involved in the government, as far as I can tell, they know that this is very precarious, and they don't have a lot of time, and they may not be able to keep the thing that's causing the United States and Western Europe to dismantle itself. They may not be able to stop it here, but they're damn sure going to try. And I'm glad to be over here learning from them and trying to encourage them.
Well, keep your missives going. It's always great to hear what you're running into and finding and seeing the patterns you're recognizing. So it's great stuff. We keep going here. All right. Well, look, Rod, I got to go teach class, Paradise Lost now. So until then.
Okay, don't get nothing on you.